For generations, the fishermen who worked the cold waters along the coast near Roanoke Island shared a strange story that most outsiders dismissed as nothing more than superstition born from long nights at sea. Yet the details of those stories rarely changed no matter who told them, and that consistency was what eventually caught the attention of historian Daniel Mercer, a researcher who had spent years studying the mysterious disappearance of the Roanoke colony, the famous lost settlement that had vanished sometime after 1587, leaving behind only a single cryptic clue carved into wood, before every man, woman and child disappeared without a trace, because according to the fishermen something appeared in those waters during the thick winter fog that seemed far too connected to that old mystery to ignore. And the sightings always happened the same way, late at night when the ocean was unusually calm and the fog rolled across the water so densely that even the moonlight struggled to break through it, creating a heavy grey silence that swallowed sound and distance alike. And it was during those moments that the shoreline sometimes changed, not gradually but suddenly, as if the fog itself had pulled back a curtain to reveal something that had been standing there unseen all along. A small settlement of crooked wooden houses stretching along the coast where there should have been nothing but empty trees and sand, the buildings dimly illuminated by faint orange lanterns flickering in windows that looked far too old and weathered to belong to anything from the modern world. And fishermen who saw the village would describe narrow dirt pathways weaving between the houses, wooden fences leaning at strange angles, and tall skeletal chimneys rising into the fog as though the entire place had been frozen in time centuries earlier. Yet what disturbed those witnesses most was not the village itself, but the people moving within it, figures walking slowly through the mist between buildings dressed in dark coats and heavy cloaks that looked like clothing from another century. Their movements calm and deliberate as if they had all the time in the world, yet strangely silent. Because even from the water no voices could be heard coming from the streets. No laughter, no conversation, only the faint creak of old wood and the distant flutter of lantern flames struggling against the wind. And whenever a boat drifted closer to the shore, the figures would begin to gather near the water's edge one by one, until dozens of them stood along the beach staring outward into the fog. Their faces impossible to see clearly through the mist, but their posture unmistakable, completely still and watching as though they had been waiting for the approaching boat for a very long time. And the fishermen who witnessed these encounters would always say the same thing afterward, that the moment their boat drifted too close to that silent shoreline, something about the air began to feel wrong, the fog thickening unnaturally fast as if the ocean itself was trying to hide whatever stood on that coast, swallowing the view of the village within seconds until nothing could be seen beyond the bow of the boat. And when the fog finally cleared, the shoreline would be empty again, with no houses, no lanterns, no figures standing along the sand, leaving only the cold dark forest behind it, and the uneasy realization that the place they had just seen looked disturbingly similar to the descriptions of the original Roanoke settlement drawn on centuries-old maps, a detail that might have remained nothing more than local folklore if not for one final detail repeated in several of the sightings, a detail that convinced Daniel Mercer to travel to the island himself, because some fishermen claimed that just before the fog swallowed the village completely, they saw shapes carved into the wooden posts along the shoreline, deep jagged letters etched into the wood, by hands that might have been there far longer than any living person could survive. Letters that spelled the same word investigators had found centuries earlier, after the colonists vanished, a word that had become one of the greatest mysteries in American history, and a word that Daniel Mercer would soon discover had begun appearing again in places where no one should have been able to carve it. The same single warning scratched into bark and driftwood along the empty beaches of the island, as if someone, or something, had been patiently marking the coast while waiting for the fog to return. Daniel Mercer arrived on the island convinced that the stories were nothing more than exaggerated folklore, yet the moment he began speaking with the local fishermen, he noticed something unsettling in the way they described the sightings. Because none of them laughed when telling the story, and none of them disagreed about the details, each man describing the same fog, the same silent village, and the same figures waiting along the shoreline, as though they had all witnessed the exact same event. And although several claimed they would never go near that part of the coast again, one older fisherman finally agreed to take Mercer out on the water during the time of year when the sightings were said to happen most often, warning him only once before they left the dock that if the fog came in they would turn back immediately. No matter what Mercer thought he saw, a promise Mercer casually agreed to as their small boat drifted out into the dark Atlantic under a pale moon that reflected weakly across the calm water, and for several hours nothing unusual happened, except the slow rolling of the waves and the distant cries of seabirds somewhere beyond the horizon. until sometime after midnight when the wind suddenly died and a thick grey mist began sliding across the ocean so quietly that Mercer barely noticed it at first. But within minutes the fog had grown so dense that the shoreline vanished completely, and the world around them seemed to shrink to the small circle of visibility around their boat. And it was then that the fisherman beside him stopped speaking mid-sentence and stared ahead into the mist with an expression Mercer would later remember far too clearly. Because slowly, almost impossibly, shapes began appearing along the coast where moments earlier there had been nothing at all. Dark outlines rising through the fog one by one, until Mercer could clearly see the crooked rooftops of wooden houses standing silently along the shore, lantern light flickering faintly behind old glass windows exactly as the fisherman had described, and as the boat drifted closer, Mercer felt the same uneasy sensation the others had spoken about. The disturbing realization that the settlement did not look abandoned at all, because figures were already moving between the houses, shadowy silhouettes stepping quietly through the fog as if they had been walking those streets for centuries. And then one by one those figures began turning toward the ocean, slowly gathering along the edge of the beach until dozens of them stood motionless at the water's edge, staring directly at Mercer's boat, their faces still hidden by the thick grey mist, but their attention unmistakable. And beside him the fisherman whispered something under his breath before gripping the wheel and turning the boat sharply away from the shore, his voice shaking as he repeated the same warning over and over while the fog thickened around them, telling Mercer in a terrified whisper that the worst thing anyone could do was let the boat drift any closer, because the people standing on that beach were not waving for help, and they were not trying to scare anyone away, they were simply waiting for someone to come ashore. Daniel Mercer could not stop thinking about what he had seen that night, because no matter how many times he replayed the moment in his mind, the details remained painfully clear. The crooked houses rising silently through the fog, the lanterns burning behind ancient glass, and the motionless figures gathering along the shoreline, as if they had been expecting his arrival. Yet what disturbed him most was not simply the existence of the village, but the strange certainty that the settlement had looked exactly like the historical sketches of the original colony from the late 1500s. The same narrow houses, the same uneven wooden fences, even the same layout of buildings positioned near the water, as if someone had carefully preserved the entire village from centuries earlier. And when Mercer tried to convince the fisherman to return the following night, the man refused immediately, claiming that once was already too close for comfort and warning. Mercer that the people who disappeared along that coast were usually the ones who let curiosity overpower their instincts, but Mercer had spent his entire career chasing unanswered questions, and the mystery of the lost Roanoke colony had haunted historians for more than 400 years, so the idea that he might have seen the colony itself somehow still existing inside that fog was not something he could simply ignore. And 2 nights later he found another small boat and returned to the same stretch of ocean alone, guiding the vessel slowly across the dark water, while the wind whispered across the surface of the sea and the distant shoreline of Roanoke Island faded gradually into shadow behind him. And for a long time nothing happened, except the quiet rocking of the boat beneath his feet until the familiar grey mist began sliding across the ocean once again, thicker than before, swallowing the horizon in every direction until Mercer could barely see the front of his own boat. Yet this time he did not turn away when shapes began forming along the coast ahead of him, because the village returned exactly as it had before, the same wooden rooftops rising slowly through the fog and the same faint lantern light glowing behind old windows as if the settlement had simply been waiting for him to return. And although a chill crept down his spine, Mercer guided the boat closer and closer to the shore until the outline of the beach became visible through the mist, and as he stepped carefully onto the sand he realized something even more disturbing than the silent figures standing among the houses. Because the moment his feet touched the shore, the figures stopped moving entirely and turned toward him all at once, dozens of shadowy shapes standing perfectly still in the fog, as though they had been waiting for someone to finally arrive after centuries of watching the empty ocean.